Hi, my name is Jeff Colgan. I'm a professor of political science here at Brown University, and I'm also the director of the Climate Solutions Lab at the Watson Institute. And so I'm going to lead off, and there's going to be two of us speaking today on the politics of conservation and climate change. And so I'm going to take the second part of that on climate change. And so I want to speak to you about climate solutions. And that means sort of starting with two topics. And the first is pretty straightforward. About climate change, you've probably heard some version of it before, which is that we are on a bad path, environmentally speaking, and that climate change is, to a certain extent, already here, and it's going to get a little bit worse. And then we can make way for a slightly happier topic about how we can do better. And politics is essential to that move, to getting to a better place. So where are we at right now? Our trajectory environmentally is not so great. You've probably maybe even seen some version of these graphs before. The one on the left is from the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and it sketches out how much we should expect the global average temperature to rise relative to sort of pre-industrial baseline. And it looks at three different scenarios, a baseline scenario, our current scenario, current policies, and even the blue box is our rosiest scenario if you give us credit for all of the promises that world leaders have made, whether they have implementation plans or not. And in any one of those scenarios, the most likely outcome is well above the 2 degrees Celsius target that the UN has set. So never mind the 1.5 degrees Celsius target that you might have heard of associated with the Paris Agreement, but even the 2 degrees Celsius target, we're not on that path. Our most likely trajectory right now is a 3-degree increase, and that's, so each degree Celsius is 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit, so that's a pretty significant increase in average temperature. Of course, on an individual day, that doesn't sound too bad. A couple of degrees warmer doesn't sound so bad, especially as we get into the colder months in New England. But on a global level, it has really serious consequences. And so we've been thinking and working about how to get to an economic path where we're not emitting the greenhouse gases that are causing climate change. And on the right-hand side, you can see some various trajectories of how we might be able to change the global emissions of greenhouse gases. And if we had started, so the solid black line you might be able to see there has been rising for the last 30 years. So now we are emitting into the atmosphere about 50 gigatons of greenhouse gases every year. And if we had started back in about the year 2000 on one of those yellow paths to lowering our emissions, then we would have taken a relatively gentle solution to try to get down to zero emissions. But we are now, unfortunately, in the position of being, or trying to be on one of those purple lines that looks like a double black diamond ski hill to try to get to a maximum increase of 1.5 degrees Celsius. We've already increased the average temperature about 1 degree Celsius, or 1.1. And so I think the realistic projection is that we're not going to make a 1.5 degrees Celsius target. That steep curve is likely beyond our reach. That doesn't mean that we should give up. There is, in fact, a big difference between a 1.5 degrees Celsius increase, or 2, or 2.5, or 3. And so each incremental bit, it's not linear. You should think of it more as sort of an exponential curve. Each incremental piece gets worse and worse for not only us as a species, but also for all other living things on Earth. And so making the effort to bring down our impact is really important. So with a very quick nod to former Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, we can talk about certain risks of known risks, uncertain risks, and unknown risks. And the known risks associated with climate change are going to happen, and the only question is how big are they going to be, how bad? The uncertain risks are things that might happen, and we don't know. The best scientists in the world don't know how likely those things are to happen in the future, in a sense because we've never run this experiment before, right? This is the first time as a planet we're doing this as a species. And then the last category, unknown risks, are the things we haven't even thought about. And unfortunately, there are some things in that category that are almost certainly going to happen. We just haven't thought of them yet. And we've been discovering new things year after year as we've seen more and more climate change effects since around 1990. I'll give you one example of a known risk, which is extreme heat days. These are days above 95 degrees Fahrenheit days. Those days, especially when combined with humidity, tend to cause deaths and health consequences that are going to get very much worse in the next 10 to 20 years. And so the number of deaths is expected to increase dramatically. So we need to build our cities differently, and we need to protect workers who are working outside, construction workers, agriculture workers, retail workers. They're going to do things differently in the future. Okay. I'll give you one visual about what kind of consequences we might see over time. This is the state of Florida, and you've got two projections here, one with a global temperature increase of 2 degrees Celsius and one with 4 degrees Celsius. This isn't all at once. It doesn't happen instantly. In fact, it takes decades to play out, but it is worth acknowledging that much of South Florida looks like it's underwater under these scenarios. Now, there are things that we can do. We can build seawalls. We can do mitigation and adaptation of various kinds. But you can see the scale of the challenge that we're building for ourselves. So I've just given you a whole bunch of bad news, and I'm sorry about that. But the good news is that we don't have to stay on this path, that the alternatives are right there for the taking. And most of the technology that we need to decarbonize our economy, to shift to a greener, cleaner economy, are already in existence. They already exist, and many of them are commercially attractive even at this point. So if you think about, for instance, the power sector, wind and solar energy are a miracle success story over the last decade, where the cost of generating electricity over time from those renewable sources has come radically down, so that they are cheaper than fossil fuels in most, in many applications today. And so that's exciting. That doesn't mean that it's easy. We're going to have to modernize our grid. We're going to have to change some technical challenges. And of course, we've got a storage problem because the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine. So there are challenges associated with this energy. But we can do this. This is something that engineers are good at. And this is something that as a country and as a world, we can move towards. Likewise, in other sectors, transportation, we're moving towards electric vehicles. There are some sectors, like manufacturing concrete and glass and aviation fuel, that are harder, much harder, and we're going to need some more technological innovation to make those technologies affordable and competitive with fossil fuels. So that's something that we're going to need. But on the whole, this is a challenge that we can tackle if we line up the politics and the economics. And so that sort of brings me to how I think about climate solutions. And I think about it, about decarbonization from 3 perspectives. My undergraduate degree is actually in engineering physics, and so I've always thought about this as an engineering challenge. So it's a technical challenge, but it's also, with the best technology in the world, it doesn't matter if it's too expensive to use, or if fossil fuels are much cheaper to use compared to that technology. So we have to get the economics right. And on top of that, we have to get the politics right, because the politics and the policies shape the economics, right? If we're continuing to not have a price on carbon, not have a price on greenhouse gases, then that creates a real problem. It makes fossil fuels look cheap, and so, not surprisingly, our economy continues to use it. So what are the paths forward? What can we do, and specifically, what can some of our policymakers in Washington and in state capitals around the country, what can they do? Well, one thing that we need to do is recognize that we've been trying to tackle this for 30 years or so, and it's not easy, right? The politics are very difficult, and so we should recognize those challenges and try to deal with them head on, right? Not ignore the trade-offs that we're facing and the political challenges. And one challenge that I see is what I call the sort of chicken and egg problem of foreign policy and domestic policy. So let me explain just for a minute about what that is. On one hand, no environmental policy, a pro-climate policy, is likely to pass the US Senate if it puts US manufacturers or the US economy at a competitive disadvantage compared to international manufacturers or international business. It's just not going to work. In fact, when the Kyoto Protocol in 1997 came to the US Senate, the vote against it was 95-0. And it was precisely because of these concerns that it would put US economies at a disadvantage. So that's a reality that we should recognize. But the other side of this is that no US foreign policy on climate change is likely to be effective or credible or legitimate if we can't get our own house in order. If the United States continues to go to other countries and say, you should stop polluting, when this country is the largest fossil fuel producer in the world, right? The largest oil and gas producer in the world. If we count coal, it's a whole other story. But that's the story that we're at. And so we have to start thinking about an integrated foreign policy and domestic policy that can address both of these problems at the same time. And so one of the things that we've been doing at the Climate Solutions Lab at the Watson Institute is to help policymakers identify what kinds of policies could do that. And so I've been writing a couple of pieces in Foreign Affairs and elsewhere on how we might use our trade policy as one mechanism for resolving this kind of dilemma. So that kind of action, the policy research, policy-oriented research that we're doing at the Climate Solutions Lab is one of the things that I find incredibly satisfying. But the other piece of this that I find really satisfying is that Brown University is stepping up its game for its students by offering more courses on climate change across the university. I myself taught the Watson Institute's first course on the politics of climate change last fall. It was the first time, and I felt like Watson Institute, as our premier institute of international affairs, needed to have a course on this topic. So it's been a thrill to see the students engage with this issue. And this is part of what we do at Brown, is to try to help our future policymakers understand the challenge that we face. Thanks so much. I'm going to turn this over to my co-conspirator here, Bathsheba Demuth, who's Assistant Professor of History.
All right, well, first of all, thank you all for coming. And secondly, I'm going to do something a little bit different than was advertised in the program today, because I was uploading a lot of decks for various talks on Wednesday, and I put the wrong one in this particular slot. So I was going to talk about various ways that conservation has worked in the Arctic, particularly around Pacific walruses. I'm happy to answer questions about that. But what I am going to tell you about instead, because of the slides I have in front of you, is actually about whales. And it's about a kind of energy extraction in the Arctic that came before the sort of energy extraction we all think about today, which is fossil fuels of various kinds. That is my very thin tie-in with Jeff's talk. It's about all I'm going to be able to give you. But instead, what I'm going to try to convince you of is actually a different way of thinking about what matters when we tell history. And this is If you're a historian, trained as a historian like I was, I started my training here at Brown actually as an undergraduate. I think I sat in this tent with my parents on a parents' weekend in some year of yore, is that usually historians are trained to look at people, right? Our job, we're kind of in the humanities side of campus, we talk about human beings. And what I'm gonna try to convince you of in the next 12 and a half minutes is why we should also pay attention to other kinds of animals and things in the world, in this case, whales. For me, in my particular research, this is a story that starts in the region of the world that geographers call Beringia. On this map, it's right where the very northeast part of Russia and the very northwest part of Alaska reach out and almost touch each other in the Bering Strait. They're only about 50 miles apart by ocean, with two little islands in the middle. And this is a part of the world that interests me because although it's very remote, it has some really interesting implications for comparative politics in the 20th century in particular, because one half was run by the Soviet Union and one half was run by the United States. But as I was doing this research, which I went into thinking of it as a comparative political project, I realized that the sea ice actually matters enormously for basically everything that I was going to end up writing about. And it matters because the sea ice actually sets the capacity for all of the ecosystems in the Bering Strait to produce life in a very basic way. So I'm going to give you a tiny thumbnail tour of the ecology of the Bering Straits. Sea ice forms about this time every year. As things get really cold up there, it starts to freeze. As it freezes, all of the salt comes out of the water so that the ice that's actually at the surface is fresh water. And this is important because in the spring, when it starts to melt, all of that fresh water runs off and actually churns the water in the entire water column of the Bering Strait. It works a little bit like a slow motion blender. And what that does is it kind of sends nutrients through the water column in a way that supports one of the richest marine ecosystems on the planet. So it's very chilly up there, but this is an incredibly biologically rich part of the world. And that richness starts with these tiny little photosynthetic organisms called diatoms and some algae. They go on to feed massive schools of krill. Oops, my slides are not advancing. There we go. Which are just big schools of crustaceans, right? They're kind of like a swarm of mosquitoes in the ocean, but they're made out of tiny shrimps and other beasties. Those go on to feed all kinds of other animals, including bowhead whales, which are the star of this show. And bowhead whales are really remarkable animals. They can grow to be almost 100 tons, 70 plus feet in length, and really critically, they can live for 2+ centuries. One of the whales that I write about in my research was born when Thomas Jefferson was president and died when Bill Clinton was president. So seen a lot of history. But bowhead whales are critical in the marine ecosystems they live in because they sort of help support other kinds of life. They do lots of work in the oceans as they're swimming and diving. And they have been critical to human beings along the Bering Strait for thousands of years. And they're critical because they take all of that energy that the diatoms make out of sunlight through photosynthesis that moves into the krill, and they condense it into material that human beings can use. You can eat whale meat, you can burn whale oil, and they are actually so kind of rich in calories that they're almost 50% fat by volume. So if you want a floating stick of butter, a bowhead whale is about as close as you're going to get. And this is really important in a part of the world where there are not trees. This is up above the tree line in the far north. It's a place where agriculture is not going to be an option. There are no amber waves of grain on the Bering Straits. But what it allows is people to live in permanent settlements thousands of years ago and up into the present. And the indigenous peoples around the Bering Straits kind of set their ways of life to follow the bowhead whales and built their settlements in places where they could hunt them easily. So bowheads have this very predictable migration route up through the Bering Strait into the Beaufort Sea and then over toward Russia in the spring. And there are historical villages going back thousands of years that took advantage of those kind of hunting routes. This was an incredibly sustainable whaling practice historically. Up into the 19th century, there were about almost 30,000 bowhead whales, and maybe 100 of them a year were hunted for people to use for food. People burned the whale oil in their houses. And in many communities, the bones of bowhead whales, particularly the jaw bones and the ribs, were critical construction materials. Because if you're living too far north for trees to grow, it's very difficult to find things to make your houses of. So it's not metaphorical to say that people literally lived in the heads of whales. So really critical resource, very sustainable, produced a kind of long-term understanding between people and whales that's reiterated in all of the indigenous communities that live around this part of the Bering Strait, that really emphasize that human life is impossible if you do not have whales. If you're unable to hunt bowheads, you're not going to be able to survive. And this kind of ethic of hunting means that people are extremely careful about how they approach bowhead whales, and actually has led the Yupik and Inupiaq, the kind of primary bow hunting communities, to talk about whale hunting as something that requires that people pay attention to the moral rules that whales have in their own world, right? People talk about whales as sentient, as capable of judgment, as kind of participating in social life in some pretty formative ways. And you can get a sense of that from the artworks that are produced both historically and in this case, a contemporary image of bowhead whale hunting as this kind of formative, critical part of indigenous societies. This is a really different way of understanding whales than bowheads encountered starting in 1848. And that's the year that the first commercial whaling ship, which left from New Bedford, Massachusetts, which is actually just down the road from us, made its way to the Bering Strait. And these whale hunters were motivated by kind of a very different principle than the indigenous hunters present already up along the straits, in that they were hunting whales for commodities, specifically for whale oil, which at the time was a really valuable way of lighting your home, and for whale baleen, which is the kind of straining mechanism in the mouths of large whale species like bowheads, which at the time was essentially used as a kind of plastic. It shows up in umbrellas and buggy whips and corset stays, most importantly. So if you wanted that 18-inch waist that women were supposed to have in the upper classes, you wore whale bones to kind of hold yourself in. And the kind of appetite for whale oil and other whale products had grown so large that the fleets out of Nantucket and New Bedford and places like that had essentially whaled their way through the species that were closer to home. So by 1848, they had gone all the way south in the Atlantic. They had gone around South America. They had started making their way north through the Pacific, past Hawaii, and eventually make their way up to the Bering Strait, which is a challenging place to whale. There's all that sea ice around, but they were really driven up because of their interest in being able to hunt bowheads. And interestingly, and this is where I get to the part about why you want to pay attention to whales, the narrative about whaling history is that people were just sort of able to show up and do what they wanted to, right? You have these kind of technologically sophisticated Moby Dick-style tall ships arriving in the Bering Strait. They were just able to kind of kill their way through the whales that they were hunting. But it turns out in the historical record that something else is going on. The first couple of years, 1848, 1849, 1850, this was possible. People could kill any whale that they wanted to hunt. And the whalers in their logbooks talk about this as kind of a bonanza time, right? They're participating really in the first oil rush in Alaska. But then something starts to change. And in particular, the whalers notice that the whales are using the sea ice in a completely different way than they used to. Bowhead whales always like to hang out kind of around the edge of the sea ice. But by 1851 and 1852, the whales would see these ships coming, they would hear them in the water, and they would run or swim for the edge of the sea ice and start to use it as protection. And in some cases, sailors describe it as the whales trying to lure them in, because obviously if you're in a wooden-hulled ship, you don't want to get too close to the edge of the pack ice because it can sink you. And this behavior change was actually so striking that for most of the 1850s, the entire commercial fleet, which is several hundred ships, completely abandons hunting bowhead whales in this part of the Bering Strait at all. They just leave it because it's become too dangerous because of the adaptations of the bowhead whales. And what's interesting about this for me as a historian is that it actually means that the whales themselves were influencing what the market in whale oil looked like. It was influencing the success of these vessels when they came back to port. And interestingly enough, there's no indication that the whales stopped being kind of easily hunted by indigenous peoples at the same time, that they were fleeing from the commercial ships, which were killing them by the thousands, but it was not a particularly difficult time to kill them in the ways that had sort of been going on for a very long time. And to me as a historian, this is kind of an instance of needing to change the focus that we have entirely on human beings and look for the ways in which other kinds of ecological circumstances, animal behaviors are actually shaping how it is that these industries are capable of carrying out their work. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you. Yes, and I think we're open for questions, both of us, so we'll just hand the mic back and forth. Yeah. Oh, sorry, yes, there's a mic in the middle if you want to ask questions there so that everyone can hear. I know.
Hello. So I saw the headline about Joe Manchin and Biden's climate agenda, so I just wanted to get your thoughts about what that means.
Yeah, I saw the same headline. It's obviously not great. So I think just in case you didn't see the headline, as many of you know, I'm sure there's budget negotiations, the Build Back Better bill that the Democrats are trying to push through Congress, which hinges on a couple of senators, Joe Manchin from West Virginia being one of them. And part of that bill is something called the Clean Electricity PP, Clean Electricity Participation Program. I can't remember what the second P is, but basically it is a move by the federal government to fund at the state level a different kind of electrical system over 10, 20 years to give all the right incentives to states to have their electrical grids powered by clean energy as opposed to fossil fuel powered energy. And this is understandably not popular in West Virginia, which has long been a coal producer and a coal producing state. And Manchin has indicated that this is a bridge too far for him. And I wouldn't take that as 100% certain that that's the last word on it. There's still sort of a fourth quarter of this game to be played out, so we'll see how it goes. But it obviously puts both the White House and Democrats in Washington in a very difficult position. But more importantly, it puts all of us in a difficult position where we're still trying to create the political conditions for the types of investments that we need. And one thing that policymakers in Washington have struggled with is that things that are often touted by economists and academics like me say, why don't we do a carbon tax, right? Why don't we put a price on carbon? Turn out to be, politically speaking, almost a non-starter, right? That they're very, very difficult because it puts the costs of climate change first, and the benefits of having done that and having switched to renewables, those come later down the road, and the biggest benefits come to the next generation. So this attempt, the clean energy program, was an attempt to put it forwards, right? To flip that and to say, let's spend the money now and invest in a clean energy program, and then we'll defray the costs over a longer period of time. And so I think that remains, at least conceptually, the right approach to go, but the reality is that the US Senate is sharply divided, and so long as we have only one political party that is seriously interested in the problem of climate change, then we're going to get this problem. That's the reality that we face. I wish I had a happier answer. You can tell I'm a lot of fun at parties.
I had a question for you all. There was an article in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago about what are the quickest ways for us to reduce the effects of climate change. I don't know if you saw it. And the person who was promoting it was saying that the two quickest ways are carbon capture and geosolar engineering. So I was curious to have you speak to both of those, but the latter was the one that he was really advocating, and I suppose feasibility is a big part of that, but just kind of interested if you could describe what it is and the feasibility of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for the question. So carbon capture and storage has a couple of different forms, but the basic idea in terms of direct air capture is to take carbon dioxide right out of the atmosphere and dispose of it in some way. Put it down in mine shafts, typically, is the idea. And that strategy is starting to be a technological option for us, but the costs are very high. There's a new plant in Iceland that's doing this, and the cost is $1,000 a ton of recovered carbon dioxide. And so if you've been following the prices on this, that's just not feasible. So the second option that was started in that article is solar geoengineering, which is to say, okay, we've heated up our planet, and so now let's use more chemicals to try to defend our planet from that heat. And so to actually spray certain chemicals into the atmosphere to try to reflect solar energy back into space and basically put a shield on our planet. I don't think you have to be too far into sci-fi dystopian films to see that this might go wrong in various ways, that we're going to spray chemicals into our planet, into our planet's atmosphere. We might have some unintended consequences from that. So I understand why people are starting to say, look, we have to take this option seriously because it's coming and the consequences are going to be very serious. And so I don't mean to belittle the position at all. But my personal view is that we should still be, at this point, working much harder at the source of the problem, right? That's really kind of treating the syndromes and not really focusing on the fact that we are pouring methane and carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and we could stop doing that, right? So for instance, natural gas industry in this country emits leaking natural gas into the atmosphere at a rate about 10 times what the same natural gases, right, same equivalent natural gas production in Russia or Europe does, right? So Russia is far ahead of us on this one because of the way of our natural gas industry is structured. That's something that we really could change, and we haven't done it because some people are making a lot of money by not doing it. And that's really frustrating. And so I would rather put the political pressure on those types of steps, which are actually quite inexpensive to do, and in many ways, about 40% of the leaked methane, it's estimated, could actually be captured on a commercially profitable way. So instead of leaking it into the atmosphere, we could pipe it into our homes and use it to cook our food. And so those kinds of easy, low-hanging fruit, they're still there on the branches, and we're just not taking them. So I would rather kind of put our effort into that, which is not to say that if you ask me 10 years from now, if we still haven't done the easy stuff, we might have to get to the much harder stuff as well. Please.
Yeah, thanks. I work with a supplier in China that told me recently they couldn't make enough goods because the government is rationing power. They can't produce enough power. And it's not clear if that's because there isn't enough of a grid or because they're trying to reduce coal. But it speaks to this issue that China's growth is being constrained by a lack of clean power and sufficient power. So can you talk about China's role and what can be done in the global context to get China to comply with these objectives when at the same time it's limiting their economic potential?
I absolutely can, but I also want to make sure that I don't have hog the mic all the time. So if you want to weigh in, by all means. So China obviously is a really important player in the issue of climate change. It is the single largest emitter. It emits about 28% of the whole world's GHG, greenhouse gases. The United States is the number 2, but it's about 13 or 14%, so it's quite a bit smaller. So China is at the core of the problem. China has a bit of an energy crunch right now. That energy crunch has multiple causes to it, and yes, it is affecting supply chains all the way around the world. To a certain extent, we may be scrambling for toys at Christmas or what have you because of these types of problems. Actually, I just released a new book. I published it just a couple of weeks ago, and my publisher can't get enough paper to publish the book. And so I've got 24 copies at my home, but if you go to the publisher's website and say, buy, you won't get a copy. You'll get a promise that it's coming soon. And so this is the sort of supply chain problems we're facing everywhere. To speak to China's energy thing, I'll just say 2 things because I could go on for too long about this. One is that part of China's problem is entirely political, right? So China decided that it was going to punish Australia for its political decisions by not importing any more Australian coal and putting a whole lot of economic pain to Australia, which was effective for a while, but guess what? They ran out of coal. And so that's part of why they're having problems generating enough power to power their factories. That's not the only cause, but that's one of them. The other thing that I wanted to say is about these types of crises is that they're enormously complicated and they create really perverse unintended consequences. And so one thing that we're seeing happen in China right now is that the factories are starting to get diesel generators on site to power their own factories, which of course is even more inefficient and pollutes just as much, maybe even more than the coal that they were relying on. And so these kinds of workarounds create more and more problems. And this is the type of unintended consequence that I think that we're going to have to manage very carefully. We are moving into what I call sort of the 4th age of modern energy. And that energy transition is going to be bumpy. We're going to see energy price spikes. And I hope that we will see wise policy making, but I can't promise it about that. So it's going to get interesting over the next decade or so.
Well, I was just thinking about the complexities of how, the gas prices in Europe and the US this winter are projected to go up by, depending on where you are, 40 or 30%. And in the US, that, could potentially be an impetus to change your heating system, to get a heat pump instead of a, gas burning furnace. But it's really hard to get the heat pumps right now because the supply chain is gummed up and they're, the ports are too clogged. And so the heat pump installers are way behind, and there aren't government incentives that can move fast enough to say, okay, if you're going to change over your heat system now, we can help you over the kind of the bump of investing in it. So it's a really complicated.
This has been super interesting. I'm wondering, besides just the whales, what other examples you might have from history of us overcoming a significant environmental problem that we can take lessons from. I think that that's been one of scientists' greatest failings, understandably so, is explaining their successes. So as a history of science person, do you have anything in mind that you would call us to?
That would work. Well, I can talk about the example that I was supposed to talk about today, so thank you for teeing up that question. So in the far north, there are a lot of stories like the kind of exploitation of whales, right, which have a real downward trend. Environmental historians call them stories of declension or decline, and they're, they haunt us, right, because we can see the failures really clearly. But there actually are, in the north, multiple cases of places where different kinds of conservation or other sorts of really forward-looking programs, right, things that are paying attention to something besides the very immediate profit motives have actually been able to take place. The Pacific walruses, which I don't know if you've seen a walrus, but they're pretty charismatic creatures. They're almost a ton. There historically have been, 250,000 of them hanging out on that sea ice that I started showing you. And they were commercially useful in the 19th century, much like whales, and were killed down to, maybe 20,000 surviving out of that huge herd. And then the Soviet Union did the same thing in the 20th century. There was a kind of a huge burst of exploitation. But interestingly enough, both the US government and the Soviet government, which of course are very different kinds of governments, they are responding to different kinds of incentives, they're motivated by different ideological concepts of what an economy should be and what a society is. Both of them actually looked at Pacific walruses and decided that it was so important to be able to maintain the presence of people along the edges of the Bering Strait, kind of for nationalist reasons, particularly after the Cold War. Like, you really want to have citizens living in the region that's closest to your most mortal enemy, that they put in place conservation rules that have allowed Pacific walruses to thrive. And eventually, even during the Cold War, started collaborating with each other about this species, about polar bears, and about some others. And to me, what's interesting about these cases is that they're ones where different kinds of public pressure, scientific pressure, and simply kind of thinking about values allowed people to make decisions that overrode kind of what made sense in the most near-term economic sense. And I think Jeff was talking about similar dynamics, right? How do we incentivize people to change their energy use in the short term when the payoff isn't necessarily going to be present, but will be for the next generation? It might even be in a decade. And to me, most of the major conservation decisions that are really work have involved people, for a variety of reasons, being able to make that leap temporally, to kind of think forward a little bit more and say, the profits are great, but I would really like my children to be able to see walruses. And sometimes it's that explicit.
Thank you very much. I have two questions, one for Professor Demuth and one for Professor Colgan. First, Professor Demuth, thank you for shifting our framing with regard to our anthropocentric view of nature and how we should be looking at what the bowhead are doing. I'm sure you're familiar with some of the work of Suzanne Simard, and so general question is, how are you bringing these scientific realities and these narratives into our understanding, which is for us to greater appreciate the complexity of these systems and turn us away from our anthropocentric view of the world? And then for Professor Colgan, to what extent are you bringing in with regard to the dynamics of the politics of climate change, the moral force of people like Greta Thunberg and Pope Francis into these dynamics, and also especially noting the great climate anxiety that a lot of our younger generations are feeling? How do those impact what you're doing? So thank you.
Those are beautiful questions, thank you. So on the question of how it is that you kind of shift the frame out of an anthropocentric mode and have a kind of more capacious capacity to think about how our world is created and functions, I'm going to say something that's going to sound really pat, but I don't mean it that way. And I think a lot of it has to do with the narratives that we tell ourselves about what matters in the world, right? What actually is influencing and changing how it is that we can conduct our lives. And that the historical tradition that I was trained in is one that focuses on what matters and events and kind of consequences being entirely driven by people. But it turns out if you just look at the empirical record, it is way more complicated than that. So it really is just a question of paying attention to things that traditionally have not been a piece of my particular discipline. And I think that for people working in the natural sciences, there's a very lovely crossover. And I actually spend quite a bit of time working with marine biologists who are putting together a picture of whales, for example, how it is that they interact with each other, talking about whales as animals that have culture, thinking about culture change in species that aren't human beings. And they are interested in looking at the ways in which human behavior has influenced those animals. So there's kind of a crossover. It breaks down some of the disciplinary divides that we're really trained in. And it's something that I think that Brown is actually very good at doing and sort of inspires on campus, partly because of what undergraduates are working on, partly because it's really something that there's a focus on it for faculty. But the result of that is that you can tell a kind of historical narrative that's much more complete, right? It's actually paying attention to the things that did influence how people acted. And as a result of that, you get over the idea that the only thing that kind of changed history or caused events to work a certain way was human decision making. That's obviously really important, and you don't want to underestimate it. And clearly in the case of climate change, if we don't figure out better decision making, there will be consequences that will be ever more acute. But I do think that the capacity to rework the kinds of narratives that we're telling is really important.
Thank you so much for the question. I do think that a sense of morality matters a lot to climate change, and just picking up on sort of where you ended your question, the sense of anxiety that younger generations have. I mean, when I taught the politics of climate change last year, and I'll do it again in the spring, I had students at the end of the course saying, thank you so much, because all my life I've been hearing the doom and gloom about climate change, and this course was the first time anybody talked about solutions, about actual paths forward. And so in the course, we spent a couple of weeks, the first 2 weeks, talking about the actual problem, but we spend the rest of the course talking about solutions, about how we could move forward. And I think having that kind of positive mindset is really important for all of us, because anybody who's working on environmental politics right now can get a little depressed. It's a tough go. I think that the way that morality matters so much in climate change is understanding how we can channel that sense of what's right in the world, and even the sense of outrage about what's not right in the world, not to individual behavior, but to systems change. Because climate change is a kind of problem that unfortunately we can't solve by individual virtuous behavior, right? So when it comes to putting in heat pumps in our houses, to pick an example that was just mentioned, I just did that 3 weeks ago. I'm glad to have done it, but I'm also painfully aware that the amount of difference I made to the world was so microscopically small that that kind of action is lovely and worth doing, and I encourage everyone to do it, but I also think what we need to be doing is picking up our phone and calling our U.S. senator or our congressperson, and channeling that change with ideas, getting out in the streets when we need to, recognizing that the sorts of decisions that need to be made not just at a government policy level, but also at a corporate level, that these things, that's where we can make change. And I don't want to cast anybody in business or politics as demons about what they're doing. I think that when we make this transition, it is going to be enormously disruptive to people's livelihoods. And so we have to start talking about what a just transition looks like. How do we move people in the fossil fuel industry into a clean energy industry where wages are different, and what does that mean, and what are the financial returns to those businesses? Happily, we are seeing the financial returns to clean energy businesses have turned out very well in the last few years, and so that gives us a little bit more momentum for the transition.
Is a slightly, simpler question for Professor Demuth. Can you talk about whether there's a happy ending to the population of the whales in the Bering Strait?
I can,
Thanks.
thank you. And thank you, because it actually is a happy ending. So the bowhead whale population was eventually pushed close to extinction in the early 20th century. That 30,000 number got down to almost 3,000. And now it's heading toward 20,000. So there's been a real rebound in the 20th century. And a lot of the kind of success of that, some of it comes from organizations like the International Whaling Commission, which has attempted to kind of regulate whaling from within. It's it's a bit like having the fox run the hen house, because it was run by the whaling countries themselves trying to impose limits. You can imagine how that went. It was not good for whales in the 20th century. But the kind of demand for whale oil has gone down to such a degree that all whale species are essentially without large-scale industrial hunters. There are a few countries that are exceptions. Japan still does some, Norway still does some, but it's not anything like it was in the 20th century. And this has really given bowheads the space to thrive. Their populations are doing really well. They are hunted still by indigenous communities on both sides of the Bering Strait, essentially at the levels that they were prior to the 19th century commercial hunt. And bowheads actually like the water to be just a little bit warmer. They tend to thrive. So there's a lot of concern about what this will mean, 15, 20 years from now, because the waters will be warmer than we know bowheads to have lived in. But for the time being, they're actually doing really well. But there's a huge caveat there, which is that shipping through the Bering Strait is about to become a kind of a major piece of life in this part of the world. It's not a place where there's ever been large-scale shipping traffic because of the sea ice, but the summer sea ice extent is getting so far north that the northern sea route, which would be able to connect China to Europe by sailing north of Russia, is now open in the summer. There's some commercial traffic already. And in the next 25 years, it could be one of the major shipping lanes in the world, right? It gets you around the Suez Canal problem that we all learned about earlier this year. And Russia is very interested in developing that shipping lane because they can charge all sorts of fees to stop in their ports as you go. And what that means is that 50-mile section of the Bering Strait is going to become an incredible choke point where tanker ships and these big cargo vessels and the bowhead whales all need to get through them, and they're going to need to get through them at the same time. And because of what that kind of shipping traffic has meant for the North Atlantic right whale, for example, which is a species that is essentially going extinct in real time in front of us, in large part because of shipping traffic, but also fishing nets, there's real worry about what the sea ice diminishment is going to mean for bowheads in the long term. So we can keep it a happy story, I guess is what I would say. We actually sort of have that collective capacity right now, but it is going to take some real decision making about things like shipping through the straits.
You framed this in terms of politics and economics. So I'm going to ask you which of the following three scenarios would change the situation. Number one, the abolition of the Electoral College. Number two, irresistible profit margins from renewables versus fossil fuels. And number three, pressure from other nations with more progressive environmental policies.
Yeah, it's great. Do I have to pick just one? I mean, look, irresistible profits has a pretty big allure to changing the way we do things. But the thing about economics of clean energy and of the kind of green revolution is that it's really deceiving. That one thing that this is a lesson that we haven't learned very well as a society, is that when we decide to kind of go big into a new industry, we can often lower the cost dramatically, right? So this is what the story about wind and solar energy is, that as governments created the incentives, which were at first not economic at all, they were loss-making moves where the governments were providing subsidies for clean energy. That started an industry around taking advantage of those subsidies, but the key here is that it's dynamic, right? So that the manufacturers of clean energy got much better at what they were doing, and so those costs began to fall, and now the government subsidies are not needed at all for wind and solar to be commercially attractive. That's the kind of lesson that we should be thinking about as we start applying it to electric vehicles and to all the other technologies that we need to make a decarbonization challenge. And so when we talk about sort of irresistible profit margins, it's not the ones that today matter, it's the ones that might exist if we can scale up the sorts of technologies that our planet so desperately needs.
I need some talking points. Let's just say I have some family that lives in states. I have a senator. If the solution ultimately is political and we need to apply political levers, and half of the country lives in states where the politics are stuck, what's the right argument to make to those, quote, family members or people you might know on that side?
I have those family members too.
Okay.
I'm not having a whole lot of success with them, and on some level we need Professor Barbara Tannenbaum on campus here. She's our expert on effective and persuasive communication, and I'm not that guy. I wish I was better at this personally. It's difficult, and I think the most important thing that I know about persuasive communication is that it can only happen when there is actual trust and rapport between the two people talking, right? And that this can't be a top-down conversation, like you don't know what you're talking about and let me show you, although that's the professor's great temptation is to go down that path. And it has to be a conversation that recognizes sort of the dignity and the ability to learn on both sides, that people who that we might want to persuade might be able to persuade us of certain things as well. And that's the kind of conversation that I think is more fruitful. But how to boil this story down into a couple talking points, gosh, I wish I could do that. And I am struggling to make that possible. I mean, we now are at this point, I'd say, fortunately, we have very good journalists and very good, writers who are working on communicating the challenge. I will salute the New York Times, which for many, many years was not terribly interested in reporting on climate change. In the last couple of years, they've really upped their game and have a climate section or climate story almost every day. And so we're starting to, as a society, see that communication. But how, of course, the New York Times only gets a certain segment of the population, and how to get it on Fox News, I don't know. I wish I could answer it better. Please. Do you have answers to that?
Thank you both.
It's such a great question.
Sorry. Thank you both for a terrific presentation. First, a comment and then a question. The comment, I remember going to a car show a number of years ago, and it was the unveiling of a new American car, an American-made car. But I looked at the specifications inside the door jamb, and less than 2% of the parts of that vehicle were produced in the United States. Yet we have 500 ships in the Pacific Ocean getting into the ports in Los Angeles. Supply chain here is severely disrupted, yet we're going to open the Bering Strait, right? So, well, we're not. So it's just a comment, but all of those things translate into some very interesting TED Talks. But my question is, reading the UN report from, I believe it was the summer of 2019, one of the UN reports, and it was about food security and food production. And there was a comment, if we continue to produce food the way we're producing food today, we will need a land area the size of the country of India to feed the world's population by the year 2050. Now, with climate change, the patterns of where we can grow and where we can't grow, it's changing right before our eyes. So, population grows, land is becoming less scarce, climate change, putting so much unpredictability right there in front of us. Yeah. There's my question. Where are we headed?
So let's start with the good news on agriculture, that we're living now in a COVID-19 era. And at the start of that pandemic, I remember March 2020, when Brown's campus closed down and I had the unpleasant task of telling my students it's time to go home for the semester. There was a lot of uncertainty about whether the supply chain for food would hold up, right? There was panic buying for toilet paper and all kinds of other things. But there was a real question about whether we could sustain our supply chain for food. And lo and behold, it held up remarkably well. This is something that is a global system. It's integrated. It's sensitive to shocks in other parts of the world. And yet, overall, it's done very, very well. I do think that climate change is a really significant challenge, and that agricultural yields for many of our most important products, wheat, soy, corn, et cetera, around the world are likely to decline. And the scenarios that I've seen are sort of 20% crop yield decline with around 2 degrees, 2.5 degrees temperature increases. And so 20% of the global supply of those crops is a really big deal, and we're going to have to change how we eat. But at the same time, I think we'll also change how we farm. And that's not a topic that I'm particularly well equipped to speak to, but I have hope and more than hope, real optimism around new modes of farming, both in kind of crop generation, regenerative farming, but also cattle ranching, et cetera, where they're talking about new additives that can change the methane production of cows. Turns out that cows are big methane producers. And so, there are additives that can bring that kind of methane production way, way down. And we don't know what that solution is going to be. It's not going to be one solution. It's going to be a whole constellation of approaches. But I actually feel fairly optimistic about that piece of the problem. If I think about all of the different things that climate change brings with it, that one is not the one that keeps me up at night the most.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I'm from the Midwest, which is a place that has seen really radical transformations in the way that food is produced within my lifetime. And in ways that are not good for the land, for the animals that are being farmed, for the people who are doing the farming, right? It's really moved from something that is potentially a thing you'd want to do with your life to an incredibly exploitative system kind of all the way down. And interestingly enough, the kind of COVID era and particularly what's happening with natural gas in Europe, bizarrely, is kind of starting to undermine some of the ways in which that factory farming system operates because of phosphorus, which requires natural gas to produce it in fertilizer. Those prices have gone up so much that the farmers, when I went back home in August, were actually spreading manure on their fields, sometimes for the first time in 10 or 15 years. And to me, the kind of lesson in that is that the incredible inefficiencies that actually exist in the way that farming works in the Midwest, right? It's being produced for beef and to make ethanol. It's actually not going to feed people. And some of the kind of inputs to that system that are not ecologically sound or sustainable are actually things that are rolled back comparatively easily, right? There are problems like, what do you do with lower Manhattan as sea levels rise? And then there's the problem of how do you get nitrogen and phosphorus back into your farmland? And it turns out one of those is actually easier to deal with than the other. And there's knowledge of how to do it on the ground, right? People remember how they have farmed in the past. That does mean things like probably not eating as much beef, right? It's going to be more expensive, but it probably should be, frankly, if we're eating in a way that in a temperate climate kind of matches what the ecologies we live in are able to bear. And it doesn't mean we're less healthy. Probably means we're more healthy. So yeah, this is one place where I do think that the human's adaptive capacity to produce food historically is marvelous, right? That's a thing I think we can figure out. How to do it equitably, that to me is the big question. It's a political question.
Thank you so much for your wonderful questions. It's really, really a pleasure to see all of you here coming out to an event like this and for caring about this issue. So thank you so much. It gives us hope.